over a number of years. But I will add that he is not the only one in this House who has taken up helping wild salmon. You see, Mr. Speaker, this member has also been working for wild salmon for nearly 20 years. And I'm guessing there are members of this House from Atlantic Canada who have also put in some time on behalf of wild salmon on that side of the country. I've had the privilege of being an active conservationist in streams, lakes, and rivers where we could go today and see the ongoing benefits of the work done. In fact, just before I returned to this fall session of Parliament, I spent some time working with DFO staff, First Nations members, and Conservation Club members, some of who had traveled from distant communities. We spent some time in hip waders, gumboots, slugging through muck and silt to the mouth of the Salmon River. There we worked with burlap fencing, sandbags, shovels, and sweat to rechannel the lower portion of the river into a singular channel that would be deep enough for migrating Chinook salmon to reach their spawning grounds. For years, this river delta has been filling in with silt to a point that it spread out into multiple fingers, none of them deep enough for the fish to leave the lake and continue the last few miles to their spawning beds. These fish, nearing the end of a spawning migration of hundreds of miles, had only a few miles to go. Without the blood, sweat, and blisters of the DFO staff, First Nations, and volunteers working together, those fish would not have reached the spawning beds and not have been able to complete their mating ritual and produce the next generation of wild salmon. Now, you might wonder how this has relevance to Bill C-228, which speaks to salmon aquaculture. Well, the silt that had filled in the Salmon River Delta is allegedly from years of logging and farming practices along the river's course. Although these practices may be the cause for the siltation and restricting the ability of the salmon to access the historic spawning channels, government is not planning to shut down or remove the farmers and loggers from their ability to continue to farm or harvest timber. What is being done instead is that farming and logging practices are being improved. Farmers are being encouraged to build exclusion fencing to keep livestock out of the river. They're being encouraged to replant riparian areas and stabilize stream banks so that not only do the salmon benefit, but the farmers benefit when they don't lose more land being washed downstream during next year's spring freshet. Through collaborative efforts, changes are being made. Farming and other activities that drive our economy are able to continue so that people have jobs. And jobs pay taxes, and taxes pay for schools and hospitals. So that is why it is relevant. Bill C-228 would force government and aquaculture farmers to completely move or change their current practices. Bill C-228 would force government to compensate these fish farmers for their losses and provide employment insurance for displaced workers. Rather than provide incentives and encourage improvement in practices, Bill C-228 would virtually eliminate the viable, job-creating, revenue-generating farming sector right out of the province and probably right out of the country. In discussions with representatives of the salmon farming sector, they have indicated that the expense of moving and changing their operations to closed containment would leave them little option. Increased operating costs would necessitate that they reduce their costs, especially transportation of goods to market. This would mean industry moves to markets in the U.S., in New York, Los Angeles, and overseas to Asia, virtually destroying jobs and income here in Canada. So, Mr. Speaker, while there are risks and possible causes for wild salmon declines, I believe those risks are better managed or mitigated through collaborative programs where fishermen, farmers, and industry can work together to improve situations that may be impacting our wild salmon. Another point I would like to touch on this bill is that in fact it only refers to salmon aquaculture in Canadian waters off the Pacific coast. and I wonder what our Atlantic colleagues in the House would have to say about the implications of Bill 228 expanding to the Atlantic coast. I find it interesting that we have heard little from those Atlantic members on this. Are they even paying attention, I wonder? Bill C-228 also states that the Minister of Fisheries and Oceans must, and I quote in part, within 18 months, prepare, table in Parliament, and implement a plan for transition to the use of closed containment facilities, setting out, among other things, specific support measures for cooperations and workers in the finfish aquaculture sector affected by this transition in order to protect the jobs and financial security of those workers, including training and income support through employment insurance system, end quote. Mr. Speaker, while I believe we need to support workers who may have lost their jobs to reasons beyond their control, I don't believe we should pass a bill that would, for start, kill jobs, that would drive revenue-generating business out of Canada, and then have government, have taxpayers compensate those businesses and workers impacted. Bill C-228 says nothing about the continued viability of the businesses or the long-term stability of the remote communities they support. Mr. Speaker, I recognize the member from Port Moody Coquitlam for his efforts for wild salmon, but the proposals of Bill C-228 are underdeveloped and underdefined. They seek to tear down the barn before a new barn can be built. While there is a chance this bill could see amendment at the committee stage, that cannot be assured. I recognize that there are concerns and issues with our wild salmon on both the Atlantic and Pacific coasts, and that this country needs to be, these issues need to be addressed and managed. However, Bill C-228 fails to promote cooperation of employees and commerce and government for the improvement of operations on a collaborative basis. Bill C-228 fails to consider the practicalities of the transition and adaptation of a sector that provides 6,000 long-term jobs, many of which are in our coastal communities. Bill C-228 would add to the tax burden borne by hardworking Canadians. While I have expressed my own commitment and concern for wild salmon and admit that there is much to be learned, the issues I have just listed prevent me from supporting Bill C-228. What I could support is a collaborative approach to the issues and a collaborative plan to manage our wild salmon and our aquaculture sector. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Good job.
Resuming debate, the honourable member for Nanaimo Ladysmith.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. We have today in this Parliament a historic opportunity to act on the key recommendations of the Cohen Commission to protect wild salmon and the wild salmon economy, and to innovate and take action on coastal job creation. The importance of wild Pacific salmon cannot be overstated. They're the foundation